focus on Aurobindo for a bit. He's been one of your biggest influences and certainly one of the great spiritual masters of India, who wrote distinctly about the transformative powers of yoga practice on the human body itself.
Yes. This study, when you begin to take seriously the possibility that the extraordinary is arising in all cultures, and you get into the study, as we have done, you find that many of these capacities are evident in physical movement, and in sport, in shamanism, in the various physical yogas. In fact, in all the great contemplative shamanic traditions, there is a huge physical component. Aurobindo helped to dramatize the idea that we do not know the limits of bodily transformation. And if you start to look at the lore of bodily transformation, it gets very, very interesting. It exists in every tradition.
And in India, I think, is an excellent tradition to begin to focus on, because for thousands of years they've maintained a detailed literature, a very disciplined philosophical approach that enumerated to a high degree the specific kinds of changes that practitioners of yoga and meditation went through.
Yes. In Hatha Yoga, you see this tremendous mastery of the autonomic nervous system. Anything that can be brought to awareness can be mastered. Interestingly enough, the more I've gotten immersed in this kind of material, I've been drawn to the Roman Catholic tradition, because no other religious tradition has made such an effort to winnow out fact from fancy in the canonization proceedings of the Church, which are run like giant law trials, in which all witnesses are put under oath, and particularly for Catholic witnesses and these nuns and these monks who observe these things and have lived with the saint involved, it is a mortal sin to lie to the promotor fide, the devil's advocate. So what has built up over the last 600 or 700 years is a huge body of data regarding the extraordinary phenomena of the contemplative life, and including these physical phenomena. So I've drawn very heavily in my own research on that Roman Catholic data.
You think it's more reliable than the traditions that have been handed down from India?
Well, it's not necessarily more reliable, but there has been a more thorough documentation of particular instances. So if you want to quote the testimony about the life of St. Teresa of Avila, you have all these nuns who observed her over the course of her life, who told in intimate detail stories about her ecstasies. There is even testimony about her apparent levitations. She said she levitated. I'm agnostic about this. Nevertheless, there's that sort of data. So it's unique. It's a unique resource.
Levitation would be one of the really extreme claims that
exactly.
one finds in this literature, and I suppose it's interesting to note that it's found in many different cultures.
Yes, it is. Now in this, my recent book, The Future of the Body, it was a big debate I had with my publisher about whether or not to include levitation. I remain agnostic about whether or not it's ever actually happened, but the quality of the testimony of these nuns who claim to have seen her levitate, or who have seen St. Joseph of Cupertino, is interesting in and of itself, not only for the wealth of testimony, but the vivid details of it, the grotesque, sometimes grotesque phenomena that seem to accompany this thing. And you wonder why this testimony is there. It looks like a kind of anthropology that is being done. But in any case, the Roman Catholic data is very rich, very detailed, quite disciplined, and it corresponds beautifully in many respects to what we have from the Eastern traditions.
Well, it strikes me, Michael, that the kernel of your work is that you've developed a taxonomy based on
Yes.
looking at the natural world. You've looked at, over the course of billions of years of evolution, what are the
Yes.
capacities that animals have developed,
Yes.
and then how in human culture have we been able to further refine those capacities, and then how, if we look at the extraordinary events,
Exactly.
they are refined even further. And you start with some very simple things.
Yes.
Not necessarily levitation
Yes.
at all.
Well, the more I've been immersed in this data, the more it has borne in upon me that all human attributes give rise to the extraordinary. And no matter how you divide up the mind-body complex to describe it, each part gives rise to the metanormal, to the extraordinary. Now, in the future of the body, I chose 12 sets of human attributes: perception, kinesthesis, cognition, vitality, etc. And each of these, across cultures, gives rise to extraordinary versions of themselves. So this is the case, and all of these human attributes, which arose out of animal nature in the course of evolution, give rise to the extraordinary. So it does give us another look at our evolutionary possibilities. Not evolution that would be passed on genetically, of course. I mean, I don't come out of neo-Lamarckian, but capacities that would be passed on through education, through transformative practices.
You referred to Lamarck a moment ago, and I think for the benefit of our viewers, we ought to define what you mean when you say you're not a neo-Lamarckian.
Well, the Lamarckian theory that if I get big muscles, my kids are going to tend to have big muscles. I mean, this is not the way it works. Our genes are relatively impervious, perhaps completely impervious to, the changes we make in a lifetime. There's a great random effect, apparently, in our offspring in terms of the qualities that come up. And natural selection in animal evolution and differential reproduction has been the mechanisms. But in human development and in the development of cultures, you have it's passed along through institutions, through education, and so forth. So
I think one of the interesting examples that you've chosen is something very basic. It's love. It's not necessarily extraordinary, but you point out if we look at evolution, it took quite a while before you got creatures who were soft and furry and cuddly and cared for their young in a loving way.
Yes, well, love is developing all the while on the face of the earth, and it can develop in us. And you could make a case that love is always extraordinary and always has the germ of this unitive awareness that I like to think of as an extraordinary type of cognition, an extraordinary way of knowing, this sense of unity between you and me that is right at the heart of love. But there are these very dramatic forms of love and that appear between lovers or in saints and mystics that bring with it an extraordinary range of phenomena, and that's interesting too. I think that one of the interesting things that emerges is if you look at human nature in its complexity, and as I said, I chose these 12 sets of attributes, you find that the development of a particular capacity, let's say extraordinary movement abilities among athletes, tend to give rise to extraordinary perceptual abilities or extraordinary cognitive capacities. And conversely, if somebody develops extraordinary cognition, say through contemplative prayer or through meditation, very often, spontaneously, these tremendous physical capacities arise.